Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Growing Soil Testing, Variable Rate Application, and Other Service Opportunities for Ag Retailers. My name is Jill Carlson, and I'm the project coordinator at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management, who is hosting the webinar this morning. We're joined today by my colleagues Dr. Thomas Green, Mark Adelsberger, and Krista Korleski. Dr. Thomas Green, president and co-founder of the IPM Institute, will provide a brief introduction. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speakers. First, we will hear from Dr. Laura Johnson, research scientist from the National Center for Water Quality Research at Heidelberg University. Second, we will hear from Joe Nestor, founder of Nestor Ag LLC. Then we will use the remaining time for Q&A. Before we begin, I wanted to share some brief logistics. You will remain muted as an audience member during the presentations, but please make use of the question box on your screen to type questions for the speakers. Please indicate if the question is directed at Laura or Joe. I will moderate the questions at the end of the presentations. By attending the webinar today, you will be eligible for 2.5 CCA continuing education units. You must be present for the entire 1-hour webinar to receive those points. This webinar is being recorded and will be available afterward on the partnershipfarm.org website and will be available afterward as well as for on-demand viewing in the Citrix GoToWebinar platform for 1 month to receive CCA continuing education units. Now I will turn it over to Dr. Thomas Green.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Special thanks to our presenters who have agreed to share their expertise and time with us. So the Partnership for Ag Resource Management is an effort of the nonprofit IPM Institute, along with a host of other projects in agriculture and communities, all focused on using the power of the marketplace to improve sustainability. Sustainability to us includes health, environment, and economics. You may have read one or more of our articles in our series for Crops and Soils magazine. So we face a real challenge in the Great Lakes, Mississippi River, Chesapeake Bay, and other watersheds. Nutrient and soil resources we need for our crops are leaving cropland and ending up in our rivers, lakes, and streams. These photos here show what happens when too much phosphorus gets into the water, feeding blooms of algae which close beaches to swimming, make fishing a challenge, and have also shut down public water supplies, including in Toledo last summer. The graph from Heidelberg University's water monitoring stations show the trend of dissolved reactive phosphorus reaching the mouth of the Sandusky River since 1975. So after declining in the mid-1980s, the advent of reduced tillage, been increasing over the past 15 years, and along with it, algal blooms. Certainly there are other sources of phosphorus as well, but we know that the phosphorus is coming primarily from cropland because of the timing of the loads. They spike during snowmelt and rain events in winter and early spring following fall applications. And you'll see more of those data from Laura in a minute. So ag retailers have valuable products and services which can keep phosphorus on cropland and out of waterways. Here's a list of some of these, along with average reductions based on published studies. Of course, there's lots of variability in these phosphorus reduction numbers based on soil type, slope, proximity to surface water, and other factors, but it gives us a sense of where we can make a difference with products and services that we can also earn revenue from in terms of reducing losses of phosphorus from cropland. Cover crops, soil testing, grid or zone sampling, and variable rate application and custom application are revenue generating opportunities to reduce phosphorus losses. We can also let farmers know when a broadcast application has been made so they can get out there and get the application covered. We can avoid application before a heavy rain event. We can abide by setbacks from surface water and let farmers know when we see an issue that needs attention, such as a tile line blown out. Of course, applying only enough phosphorus for the following crop rather than the next several crops in the rotation can also make a difference in keeping phosphorus on the ground. So today we're focusing on soil sampling and variable rate technology. Sales of these services are increasing, but still very far below potential. The top graph here shows our survey data of ag retailers for variable rate technology through 2014, and then projects the growth trend that we've observed in our survey out to 22 for the Western Lake Erie Basin. Below we show estimated loss reductions for total and dissolved reactive phosphorus based on averages from the scientific studies. So you'll hear in this presentation how soil sampling and VRT benefit your farmer customers and learn how best to present that return on investment to them to close the sale. This is especially important given current crop prices. So our overall goal with Partnership for Ag Resource Management is to identify revenue opportunities for ag retailers that help keep our valuable resources on cropland, help promote those, and track and report sales and reductions in losses of phosphorus and other inputs. We are making a difference as our sales trends show. We need to track and report those so that regulators and the public are aware that we can make improvements on a voluntary basis using the power of the marketplace to drive improvements. So with that, I'd like to turn the mic back over to Jill and our other presenters.
Awesome, thanks Tom. So next we'll hear from Laura Johnson, research scientist at the National Center for Water Quality Research.
Hi, I'm Laura Johnson. I'm a research scientist at the National Center for Water Quality Research at Heidelberg University, which is located in Northwest Ohio. And today I'm going to talk about phosphorus runoff from Lake Erie watersheds. Now, why am I focusing on Lake Erie? Well, algal blooms in Lake Erie have been increasing pretty tremendously over the past decade. This image here shows the 2011 harmful algal bloom, which is the biggest harmful algal bloom that we've recorded. These blooms are made up primarily of a type of cyanobacteria called Microcystis aeruginosa, and this is a cyanobacteria that can create toxins that can make us sick and affect our livers. Now this image shows the size of the harmful algal bloom based off of satellite imagery, and you can see what the satellite imagery looks like. This is that same Western Basin bloom. It covers most of the Western Basin, these are the islands, and it goes off into the Central Basin, which is this middle part of the lake here. And when you take that imagery and you can turn it into a cyanobacterial index, which NOAA does, you can see here that 2011 was by far our biggest years, but since 2008, barring 2012, we've had 6 of our largest algal blooms since we've been reporting them in this way and also in terms of other ways that we've recorded them. And this all came to a head in 2014 when the toxins from the 2014 bloom shut down Toledo's drinking water plant. And then this year, we're also predicting a very severe bloom. This is showing the predictions over time, or the bloom severity index over time, with the prediction here for 2015 being a severe bloom, likely like 2013, but possibly as bad as 2011. And indeed, this bloom has been very big very early on. This is the 2015 bloom on August 16th. You can see it's covering much of the Western Basin. It's hovered quite a bit around the islands here and even has reached all the way up into Canada. But if we zoomed in on the islands right here, you can see what that water really looks like. So this is a common limnology method of looking at how transparent the water is. It's called a Secchi disk, and you can see that in this image, it was a negative transparency reading. And if we turn that into true color, so this is what NOAA puts out with the HAB bulletin showing the actual density of the different cyanobacteria throughout the basin. You can see the hot spots were really right here along the southern shore of the Western Basin, and then a little bit around Sandusky. So the big question then is, why are algal blooms returning to Lake Erie? Luckily, over this period of time, as a part of the Heidelberg Tributary Loading Program, we've been monitoring many of the rivers that go into Lake Erie. You can see that we cover the River Raisin, Maumee, Portage, Sandusky, and Cuyahoga. These are the main tributaries. The Sandusky and the Maumee, we've been monitoring water quality at those 2 locations since 1974. River Raisin and Cuyahoga we added in 1982. We also monitor it at multiple other stations. We have subwatersheds within the Maumee and the Sandusky. As a side note, this station here at Rock Creek is where Heidelberg is located. We also have added tributaries that go down to the Ohio River, these three here. Those are added in the mid-1990s, and then we have some tributaries around a highly eutrophic lake called Grand Lake St. Mary's. Now, at each one of these locations, we have an auto sampler that collects samples 3 times a day that's housed within a little hut beside the river. Our technicians go out every week, every Monday, and collect the samples and bring them back to the lab for analysis. And we analyze for all the major forms of nitrogen and phosphorus and a multitude of other things as well. We also look at how many sediments are in the water. Each one of these stations is paired with the USGS gauge, so they get how much discharge or flow of water is coming out, and we have the water quality side of that. So what I'm going to talk about today is phosphorus. And in the lab, we really deal with 3 primary forms of phosphorus. We have total phosphorus, and you can see that in this first image here. And that's essentially if we took this beaker out and grabbed a raw water sample, it would have the sediment-bound phosphorus in it. It would have whatever is in the water itself. We can filter out those particulates and trap them on a filter paper, and anything that makes it through is then considered to be dissolved. Because we're a water lab, we analyze the water sample. So we analyze total phosphorus, we analyze dissolved phosphorus. Any mention of particulates is done by difference. And we do this because dissolved phosphorus is 100% bioavailable to algae, whereas particulate phosphorus is only about 24% bioavailable. So whereas particulate phosphorus often makes up the bulk of what's in the total phosphorus, because you can see how muddy this water can be, it's the dissolved phosphorus that can be really yummy. And I like to think of this as, dissolved phosphorus is like the refined sugar of the algae world for phosphorus, whereas particulate phosphorus is more like the whole grains, maybe more like the cardboard. So what have we been finding over time? This is an image showing the trends in total phosphorus. So I have the picture up here to remind you which one I'm talking about. For all of Lake Erie. So this is all of the tributaries that have made it in, and we've been able to partition them out into the different sources. And so you can see this starts in 1969. Back then we weren't really able to partition them out. Starting when we began our monitoring program, we were able to do that. Now, if we look at the point sources are the sewage treatment inputs or industrial inputs. You can see the red lines here. They've largely decreased, and since about the mid-1980s, point sources have been fairly stable. When we look at the non-point sources, this is like land runoff. It doesn't necessarily have to be agricultural as shown in this picture. It can also be urban runoff. You can see that has basically fluctuated from year to year. It depends on how much rain we get. But the big picture is that overall, the total loads of phosphorus making it into the lake have decreased and have remained pretty steady over the past 15 years. So when we look at total phosphorus, we're missing part of the picture here. And so what we're missing is dissolved phosphorus. The dissolved phosphorus changes that get, they basically get hidden by including all of those particulates. So what we're finding is that dissolved phosphorus concentrations have increased from our agricultural watersheds. We see it in the Maumee River, which is 73% agricultural. We see it in the Sandusky, which is 78%. Both of these we had high concentrations early on. They plummeted into about the mid-90s, have since increased and leveled off. The Sandusky's has leveled off at levels that were higher than when we know that the lake was in trouble back in the mid-70s. For the Cuyahoga is mostly urban. It's dominated by point sources of phosphorus, and we see a very different pattern. We see that phosphorus concentrations decreased because of regulations on sewage treatment plants, and have remained pretty steadily. There's a little bump here, but the important thing is that we see that these concentrations have been decreasing since about the 2000s. So very big differences when we include agriculture in our basins. But what's important here is that when we take these losses and we scale them up to the watershed, they're only about 1 to 5% of the phosphorus that's being applied. So we're talking about huge changes that are important for the lake and causing algal blooms, but on the agronomic side, these are very small losses and farmers are still being fairly efficient with their phosphorus. So then that brings up the big conundrum, which is why is dissolved phosphorus increasing in the first place? And we think there's a whole realm of different things that are interacting to cause this issue. So if we have our farm field here, you can see water can run off the surface, it can come through tile drains, make it into a ditch, and get into the lake. If we zoom in on the soil itself, what we think is happening is that we're having soil stratification, which you can see here. Stratification is simply the accumulation of phosphorus towards the upper layers of the soil. So there's higher concentrations of phosphorus at the top compared to the bottom. But we also think we're seeing some development of macropores. Now this isn't new, we know macropores have been around for a while, and that these are the cracks and fissures, root channels, earthworm holes, anything that makes it so that water can more easily go through this rather than going through the matrix flow, which is that slow filtering type of flow through the soil. The other thing is that we think we're getting a lot of runoff in our tile drains, but then we also think that we're seeing increases in precipitation intensity, which is making all of this more complicated and interact even more. So what I'd like to do now is show you some examples of each of these different parts and show you how they're interacting. So the first thing I want to show you was soil stratification. This is a project that we conducted a couple of years ago. We sampled over 1,500 farms throughout the Sandusky River Basin. We used CCAs to help do the sampling. And so when they'd go out to do their normal soil test, we asked them to also do some stratified soil tests. So your typical soil test is 0 to 8 inch. We also split it into a 0 to 2 and 2 to 8 inch cores, and because of that we said, well, let's split it into 4 as well. So it's 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 5, and 5 to 8. Now the first thing is these numbers here are showing the average. So in our 0 to 8 inch core, most of these farms were perfectly within the maintenance range. So this is exactly where farmers are being recommended to have their soil tests. Of course, there's huge variation across all of these farms, but the important point is that really only about 10% of the farms were above 71 ppm. Note this is in Malick 3P, not Bray, so we adjust it up, but that's that upper limit where you really shouldn't be applying any more phosphorus if you had wheat in your rotation and you're expecting really high yields. So most people are within those recommended levels, probably somewhere a little high. But when we look at these stratified soil tests, we can see that most of that phosphorus was in the top 2 inches. When we go to 4 parts, we can see almost all of that was also within that top 1 inch. And if we got even smaller, if it was possible, we'd probably find even more in that very, very top surface. So this means that phosphorus is accumulating on the surface. And that also means, and this is important because that's where rainwater interacts. And it rains and interacts with the surface, and it's going through the macropores into the tile drains and out to the ditches. So this suggests that we might be grossly underestimating the phosphorus that's available to run off. And I want to point out, which I didn't point out earlier, is that all of these samples were collected with a rotational no-till. So that meant that before corn, there was either chisel or disc plowing, very little moldboard plowing, of course, but we were working the ground some. So stratification can occur even if you're incorporating, even if you're working the ground, it still happens. This is just showing you some evidence of macropore tile drain flow. These are photos from Kevin King. He runs an edge of field research program out of USDA ARS, and he's got sites all over Ohio. And he had some of the really great pictures of what these types of cracks can look like. You can see they can be quite deep. This is a earthworm, I think this is a root channel hole right here. And in this top picture, you can see that there are the little fertilizer pellets that are here. Now this farmer then did incorporate this fertilizer because this is not good news for our streams to leave it like that. But I wanted to show you some evidence of what this type of tile drain flow would look like. Now this is an edge of field site that Doug Smith runs at the St. Joseph River watershed, which is a sub-watershed to the Maumee. And basically you can see here, this is one storm in May of 2011. We see it rained in the blue. Then we had in the black here, surface flow peaked, came down very quickly. Tile drain flow came up, peaked at the exact same time that surface flow peaked. And then it, it tailed off and slowly drained the field out after that. But what this suggests is that most of this water that's coming through the tile drains is coming just as quickly as it's going off of the surface flow, which also implies that probably most of this water is surface runoff. It's just as quick as it is if it was just coming off the edge of the field. And so if we put all this together, we are indeed finding that because of all of the water that comes through tile drains and how quickly you can get there, that most of the dissolved phosphorus loading is from these tile drains. This is showing Kevin King's edge of field work. Again, he has 40 different fields throughout Ohio, and partitioning off the tile versus surface loading. The tile is in black, the surface is in white. Some places don't have tile measurements. I can see these here. Some of the places don't have surface measurements. So if you don't see a color, that's because it's not there. But in the places where we have both, in almost all cases, the tiles are making up a vast majority of the loading. And this dotted red line, he says it's the task force recommendation, but this is a little bit high. These recommendations are likely going to be closer to this bottom line here, which suggests that although there are some farms that are lower than what their targets are, there's an awful lot that are higher, but there's also a lot of variation based off of the different fields. These very high ones here are fields that are draining legacy manure applications. And so the other thing we're seeing is that this intense precipitation is increasing, so getting more than 2 inches in one day. Now this figure is showing these cumulative days of greater than 2 inches of precipitation. So you can see we start in 1982, we have 1 day of rain, blah, blah, blah. We go until about 1984, we keep going. It wasn't until 1990 that we got another day where we got 2 inches, etc. If we add these up over time, what we find is that in the first 16 years of this figure, there were 8 events. But since 1998, we've had 20 events where we've had more than 2 inches of precipitation in one day. And this doesn't include the extreme weather that we got this summer. We had 3 different days just this summer where we got over 2 inches of rain. So now we're up here above 30 cumulative days over this period of time where we have precipitation over 2 inches. So what does this mean? This means basically everything that I said is happening seems to be happening, and nothing really works on its own. It's all in concert. So we have soil stratification, which means that we have rain is interacting with very high concentrations at the surface. They're making it into macropores, out of tile drains, and into our lake. And all of this process is further enhanced by the fact that we're getting that much more rain. And we know when we have intense rain, it's much harder to control. So the big question then is, how can we actually do anything to reduce dissolved phosphorus runoff? Well, the first thing to do is to consider following the 4 R's of nutrient management. This is applying fertilizer at the right time, in the right place, using the right rate and the right source. Now the right time is a pretty logical one, not before rain or on frozen ground, but I wanted to show you that when those applications occur, we can see it in our water quality data. So this is Honey Creek, which isn't too far from here, and in 2011 there were a series of fall storms that made it really difficult to get out and put fertilizer down. So you can see that there's a whole set of them starting in October all through November and December. So the first time in which farmers got out, it seemed to be right before this one big storm here. You can see that we had a big peak in phosphorus concentrations. This is that dissolved phosphorus again. By the time the fields finally dried out enough to get back out again, we had another storm. Now look, this storm wasn't nearly as big, but our peaks were that much higher because there were far more people out there then. Had another case shortly thereafter, another peak. And these concentrations, this is a milligram per liter. This is the limit for sewage treatment plants. Okay, so this is like saying that what's coming off of this creek is like what would be coming out of those treatment plants' pipes. So very, very high concentrations. However, we know this is somewhat of a moot point because over here in Ohio, with Senate Bill 1, these types of practices are now going to be restricted. The other thing is to get it off the surface. Dr. Rem Confessor here at Heidelberg has done a lot of modeling to figure out, how many practices can we put into a watershed? Will we be able to reach any limits or target goals that are being set by other agencies? And so he used the SWOT model, and what he did is he said, okay, well, our typical type of management in this region is rotational no-till, applying at what our tri-state recommendations say they should be applying at. So what if we did something like changed all of the practices to inversion tillage or mold bore plowing? Well, if we did that, you can see here that we would have a huge increase in sediment runoff. So this is above that 0 line, so we saw an increase relative to typical practices. But if we switch to, say, no-till, these 3 here, you can see that we're lower. So if everyone did no-till instead of rotational no-till, we'd lose less sediment. If we did chisel plow, we're about the same. And then these other little bits here show broadcasting, how you apply your fertilizer. So you broadcast, you subsurface apply. No-till is you have the same amount of, same subsurface versus broadcasting applications as we did in the zero typical managements. So let's look at dissolved phosphorus now instead. So let's see here. So if we change all of our practices to surface applications, so we all are broadcast, there's no banding anymore, no injections of any sort, you can see that even if we're chisel plowing or for no-tilling, we're still going to have huge increases in dissolved phosphorus. And that the only time in which there's any decrease in dissolved phosphorus runoff is if there's subsurface applications. And this is knifing or injecting below 2 inches of the soil. This is not just incorporating. And even if we have chisel plow, moldboard plowing, or no-till, that is the practice that reduces dissolved phosphorus. The other two things also seem fairly important. Some of Kevin King's work is showing that once we get above those up to upper limits of the maintenance range, up here or higher, we start to see far higher exports. So if we can get as close to this critical level where applications of phosphorus are having a yield benefit instead of just maintaining a big pool of phosphorus in the soil, we think that would have a huge impact on reducing phosphorus losses. And then the final thing that we never really talk about that much is using the right source. Now, there's not a whole lot of choice in this. It's either MAP and DAP or manure. However, if there are any less soluble forms, if they come together and become available, then those would be good choices to consider using. There's other practices that are very common on the landscape that that may or may not help with dissolved phosphorus as much as the 4Rs. Grass buffer strips, they're very important to reduce sediment, and we don't want to lose all of our soils. But they don't really do a whole lot for dissolved phosphorus, in part because most of the dissolved phosphorus loss is going through tile drains, which bypass these grass buffer strips. So you have to remember that dissolved phosphorus is moving with the water. So in a case where we might have saturated buffers where those tiles are broken, that might help. Cover crops have a lot of promise. They could help a lot, improving organic matter, changing how much water is exported, and increasing infiltration. Those are all really great things. However, if the amount of phosphorus on the surface of your soil is really high, these roots from these cover crops are still macropores, we could still see high losses of phosphorus. So at the minimum, we would suggest avoiding those winter kill crops like radishes that basically just leave huge macropores covered with really soluble phosphorus around it. And consider doing an inversion tillage if you really have high surface phosphorus. Go out there, do a stratified soil test, and inversion till, and then you can put on cover crops to then improve your soil health from there on out. Or if you're doing this, try very hard to subsurface inject your fertilizer. The final thing is control drainage, which has a lot of potential because, like I said, if we can control the water, we control the dissolved phosphorus. But we have to remember that controlled drainage is, it requires a lot of basically installation costs, and there's a lot of tile drains. So, that's something that I think more people should do, but it might be cost prohibitive. So in summary, what I just showed you is that dissolved phosphorus is the most available form, and that's been increasing in these Western Lake Erie agricultural tributaries since the mid-90s. This increase seems to be associated with increased surface accumulation of phosphorus on the soil, coupled with increasing runoff and more intense tile drainage. So all of these things are coming together to cause some of these issues. We think that following the 4Rs would probably be the most effective way to reduce dissolved phosphorus runoff. It's an easy thing to just start and do. But we also know that there's some more incentives that we need. We need more technology and opportunities. I know in our region we really don't have that much access to the equipment required to inject phosphorus, for instance. And there's a lot of farmers here that would need to have access to that type of equipment. But the most important thing is that all of that modeling that I showed you before, that was assuming that every farm in the watershed changed to one of those practices, and they were just barely getting to some of those target limits. What this suggests is that we probably need some widespread implementation to reach these current target decreases. Just targeting the top 20% is not going to be enough. So with that, I'd like to leave all my information up here. Feel free to get in touch and ask questions if you have any. Also, a lot of this information is on on this website, lakeeriealgae.com, that we've put together to hopefully be a resource for people in the future. And with that, then I will hand over the control back to Jill.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura.
My name is Joe Nestor, and I have an independent crop consulting business in Northwest Ohio. I've been involved in agriculture here as an agronomist for 38 years, and we work primarily in the western Lake Erie Basin. So we're dealing with some sensitive watersheds here, and I want to talk today about soil testing, variable rate technology, and some service opportunities for dealers in the Great Lakes areas and beyond. So I guess, I want to talk a little bit about what level soil testing is done now, and this is what we see when we're dealing with farmers in the region. Some fields have a few samples in them. Not really very representative when it comes to making a good agronomic recommendation. Some of these tests are as old as 5 years that we see. So there's an opportunity for many fields to have better nutrient management plans with better, more thorough soil sampling and more regularly. And really this leads to more profit for the farmer when you're managing these nutrients. I think a lot of fields today were smaller fields years ago, and they've been combined for efficiency. So there is a lot of variation out there. So that definitely can lead to better profit for the farmer, not only on the expense side, but also on yield and income. And definitely it's better for water quality. When we're practicing the 4 R's and we're putting the right nutrients in the right place, that really helps a lot. So I spoke of representative soil sample, and I think that's the key to profitability and stewardship. And zones today can be based on various information. We have digitized soil type maps. We have yield maps, which is one of my favorite levels of information, and we have the ability with our computer programs to do multi-year analysis, where we combine multiple years and crops together and can produce maps that give us good tendencies of where the high yielding and low yielding areas of the fields are. We also have a lot of elevation maps that are available, which can be a great tool in developing a blueprint for soil sampling. And really what we're chasing here is exchange capacity and water holding capacity. We want to group those like zones of a field together so that we can manage the nutrients in them. And then also we have imagery today that we just really come onto the scene in the last few years and really exploding. And some of this imagery has the ability to show agronomists and growers their management zones and where they lay, and I'll show you some of that here a little bit later. So we want to build this data and evaluate it. So soil testing is not a perfect science. That's why you don't want to live on just a few samples in a field over a long period of time. It is variable. We have to keep chasing it. But multi-year data can give you the basis for sound decisions. I get real comfortable when I can lay out 3, 4, and 5 soil tests for one field and see where the tendencies have been, where we're going, and depending on the cost of nutrients and the economics, we can make a sound decision that way. Every other year, I think, is a real valuable way of approaching soil sampling. With that kind of data, you never get too far away from a soil test when you're making a recommendation, and it's easy to start building good data. And zone size can really vary today, but the economics out there can easily support 8 acres and less for management zones. If you're looking at a zone that, we used to think 12 to 15 acres, and even NRCS talks about 20 acres and less as a zone. But I really think that's outdated. As a farmer, if I've got a zone in a field that's 3 or 4 acres and it's losing 50 bushel of corn per year, it's well worth my time to dig into that and see if there's a corrective treatment we could make. Management zones also have multiple uses today that we didn't have years ago. And we start out with VRT Lime, P and K. I think that's your leaders out there that you want to get farmers on board with. But we've also got a lot of farmers today and a lot of seed companies looking at variable rate seed populations. We have many growers that run variable rate starter. That's a good way to manage your phosphorus in zones and fields that have mostly adequate phosphorus but might have a few zones that need it. And we're really looking at variable rate nitrogen as the next thing on the horizon here. We've done a lot of work with that the last couple of years. We are using the Solvita soil test, soil health test, to help us make variable rate nitrogen recommendations, and I think that shows a lot of promise. But these zones can also be used to track soil health and quality with that test. So if the farmer's using cover crops or techniques that they're trying to improve soil health, then these zones can be used for that. And also test plot evaluation. We run a lot of tests. We manage the MAWME on-farm network, where we have, since 2008, averaged about 40 fields a year of nitrogen trials. And with our management zones, we can cookie cutter those plots out and do some evaluation by soil type, so the farmer can learn more about plots rather than just side by side, which can be misleading at times. So I guess these management zones here, as you look at the possible uses, grid sampling really doesn't fill the need for seed population and some of these other things. So I think it's a step above what grid sampling has been. So let's talk a little bit about grid sampling here. And the things that I've seen, first off, it ignores any input from the local agronomist or the certified crop advisor. We start out with a boundary, and then we have the computer determine where those samples in the field will be taken depending on the size that you enter into the computer, the size of the grid. That's one of the things that could be an issue with grid sampling. It also ignores input from the farmer and the crop. And the farmers that we work with know more about their fields than we ever will. They've been on them time and time again, year after year, and they know where those zones change. And so it's very valuable to have the farmer's input as you set up a blueprint for soil sampling. But also the crop itself. I think who better to ask than the crop as far as where these water holding capacity zones change in a field. And grid sampling, you can ask yourself, is it representative? Since it's computer driven, actually the programs guide the sampler to the center of a grid, and usually what I see is they step off the four-wheeler and maybe sample 4 or 5 probes right around the ATV. So really they may be sampling a 10 by 10 area out there. Then when the data comes back from the lab, it fills the size of grid of whatever it is, when really they only sample 10 feet by 10 feet. And I've seen it perhaps create more variability than is really out there. And if you're going to do every other year sampling, grid sampling is going to be more expensive. So let's say that we have that 10 by 10 sample and that data fills 2.5 acres, then many times I see programs where that grid, that grid is divided into cells that match the application equipment. So a 2.5 acre grid is then divided into 50 foot by 50 foot cells, and those cell values are estimated by a mathematical equation that's based off of the known areas that were sampled. So, you know, in a 2.5 acre grid, there's 43.5 50 foot by 50 foot cells. So if we've only sampled one of those, really we're working 97.7% on estimated values out there. In zone sampling, I wanted to show this field here. This is roughly an 18-acre field. It's got 3 different soil types in it, which we've labeled A, B, and C. And these are the soil probes that were taken from those 3 different areas of that field. So at the top of the slide, we've got a clay loam. At the center, we've got a heavy clay soil. And at the bottom is a sandy loam. Now, if you mix these soil probes together in a bag and send them to a laboratory, you're going to get a result back. Unfortunately, it won't represent anything that you have in your field to manage. And you're going to do some blending here, so you might be getting areas that need lime on these heavy soils and combine them with the low exchange sand, and you'll come up with areas that don't look like they need lime. And so really you have to segregate these management areas by exchange capacity and make sure that what you're putting in the bag is representative of everything else within that bag. Thought I'd show some yield analysis here. This is a field that had 2014 soybeans in it, and we have a multi-year analysis here where we took several years of yield maps and put them together, and you can see the green is high yielding areas and the red is low yielding areas, and then we can segregate those zones out and have an approach to the field that matches the yield zones. And you can see there's some zones in there that are fairly small. You can see some 3 and 4 acre zones, and then we have some that are approaching 6 acres. And this one we've been fairly aggressive with. We've got some fields that we work on 7 to 8 acre average zones. This one's going to average about 5 acres. This is the soil type of that field, which the soil survey, the digitized soil survey is pretty decent for what they had to work with, but it was really never developed thinking that we would be using it for precision agriculture the way we are today. So it's a decent layer, but I think there's better information out there from yield maps. So you can see in the bottom of this map, this Napanee silty clay loam is some pretty big zones there, but when you look back at the yield map itself, we have some high yielding and low yielding areas within that same perceived soil type. So I think we can do a little bit better than that. So this is a fertilizer application using BRT that we built for this specific field, and you can see there's areas of the field where we only needed 140 pounds per acre in the red zones, and in the dark green we needed as high as 250 pounds per acre. And this is just a one-year application that was made in the fall of 2014. So this does add up after a while when you can use these high rates and low rates within a field. If we've got plenty of nutrients in those zones, really no need to spend the farmer's money, and also have a situation where we might lose some nutrients because we've got an overabundance of them in a zone. This is that same field, and we're in a project with Dr. John Fulton from Ohio State this year, where we're looking at multiple imagery providers on several fields and comparing them. But this is a thermal image that was made on May 22nd, and really, so it's showing hot and cold areas, temperature changes within the field, which you would assume is water holding capacity. And it does relate very well to the yield zones that we've developed on this field already. I was pretty happy with the way that compared. So that might be something in the future too, that if growers don't have yield maps, or maybe chopping a lot of silage or something like that, there's other sources out there where they can do the blueprints for sampling, use those as sources. This is another field I just wanted to run by you. This is a soil type map, and this LC is a latte clay, and the HV is a Hoytville. So heavy soils to the lower right-hand side of this map, 300-acre field. And so when we first had, this was all the information that we had for this field, we developed sampling zones that in those large soil types, we just broke them out by rectangles and then used that as our sampling scheme. But we got a yield map, the grower put a yield monitor in, and you can see that although that soil type is similar, the same on the soil type map, we've got a wide variation in soybean yield there, from nearly 60 bushel to in the 30 bushel range within the same soil type. So we laid our grids over it, and it doesn't look really good. We've got high yielding zones that we're combining with low yielding zones, and so we used that yield map, let the computer tell us what the yields were by zones, broke it out, and used that as our sampling blueprint, and went back out and resampled this field back in 2008. And so this is what we took to the field with the four-wheeler, and what we ended up finding was nearly all those low-yielding zones were deficient in lime, and that didn't show up with the previous soil sampling protocol we were using, because we were blending areas that needed lime with areas that didn't need lime. And in this particular map, the bottom number within the cell is the tonnage of lime that we're applying. So had some lighter soils up in the top left-hand corner of this field that really needed a lot of lime, but this farmer had been taking a few samples on this field and managing it that way, and he was really missing a lot of productivity. We're going to move on a little bit here now and talk a little bit about cover crops. I think this is also a very valuable tool that suppliers could become involved with. I think one of the major issues we have in our area with cover crops is timely application. With the crop growing out there, most times cover crops should be planted before that crop is harvested. So you're left to aerial applications, which the timing may not be the most optimum for you when that plane shows up. But we have a customer of ours that took a nitro sprayer here, removed the spray tank and put a seed tank on it, and uses that to apply cover crop within standing crop. Now this picture was taken during a drought year, so we had some short corn, but he's out there running today as I'm talking to you. He's running some 10 and 12 foot tall corn with this machine, and we're getting some real good stands with it. This is what that field looked like with a combination of cereal rye and tillage radishes. And at harvest time, we had a real good cover out there that was holding our nutrients as well as improving that soil. We had a food source for the biology of the soil over the winter and in the early spring, rather than taking it all away at harvest time. And we've really been surprised at how fast these cover crops can change the quality of that soil, change the water infiltration rate, and increase organic matter. So those are, I think that's something that farmers could really be interested in if a supplier had the ability to apply these cover crops for them. Might be a way to extend the season and the usage of their custom application spray equipment and cover some more acres and do something that's really good for the soil and productivity as well as stewardship. Was asked to also mention strip till here. This is a customer of ours that's doing variable rate strip till. So he's blowing fertilizer into the strip with RTK guidance on the tractor, and then he'll come back in the spring and plant on those exact strips. So his placement of fertilizer is optimum, and we've been able to run some tests here, and with strip till we've been able to drop P&K rates 25 to 30% with no noticeable yield loss, and it's because of the high recovery rate of the corn plant when you plant it right on top of that band of fertilizer. So again, a very environmental friendly way of applying fertilizer. It's not on the surface where it's subject to runoff, and we're using BRT based on his yield management zones, and then we're cutting the rate because he is having an excellent efficiency with that placement. Get another look at the strip, and the fertilizer's down about 5 to 6 inches under the surface. We're also using BRT nitrogen. I mentioned that earlier. We're doing a lot of testing this year, and we started last year with it with some excellent results. Using the Solvita soil test as our basis for determining what those specific zones of the field can deliver as far as nitrogen and nitrogen efficiency. So I think that's the next real possibility. Farmers themselves may be hesitant to invest in this type of equipment, but as far as a custom applicator, again, I think that's a service that will pay for itself if you would be willing to invest in that and take it to the field. One other item that might be a way to utilize existing equipment and extend the season would be adding a box to equipment that could go down through standing crops. We have many times in these heavy clay soils, and we don't get an optimum window to apply fertilizer before the crop is planted without compaction and risk of high loss. But when you apply to a growing crop, you can be pretty well assured that those nutrients are going to stay put. So we've seen some suppliers in this area add dry boxes to their rogators and equipment like that so that they can run through standing crop, again extending that season and putting that nutrient closer to the time that the crop's going to need it to minimize risk of runoff. So this is where we like to take a proven approach with our clients. With VRT and the zone-based georeferenced sampling, I think you can really provide a service to the farmer that's needed. The tools are available. They are affordable out there. It's something you can charge for. Farmers willing to pay for that. And managing soils and nutrients is definitely a moving target. It's not exact. It's not something that you want to live on a 5-year-old sample and be comfortable with if nutrient prices change drastically or if weather conditions don't allow your normal application. Sometimes farmers can get really uncomfortable. So one thing I tell our customers that better crops change soils faster. So the need for that database and a current database and a thorough database on soil nutrients is really valuable. So you just have to keep chasing it. So the reasons for precision agronomy, the infield variation is there. I spoke earlier that the small fields of yesterday have become today's large fields, and the yield differences are there. We have some areas in Paulding County, Ohio, where we have a square mile that is all one soil type, but we bring in yield maps from those fields, and there's drastic differences and ranges in the yield within the field. So just because it's the same soil type on the map doesn't necessarily mean that the nutrients that are there in the soil and also the nutrients that that crop's going to require are the same. That is very valuable to the farmer too. It's a cost control item versus a shotgun. I've never yet seen a farmer or a supplier who went into VRT nutrient management. I've never seen them go away from it and go back to the shotgun approach. I think they've all seen cost savings as well as yield improvement. You can go for maximum economic yields within fields, and if you've got areas that have high phosphorus within a field, you can take that money and put it somewhere else into areas that perhaps have low levels. The stewardship is really there. This is, again, the 4 R's of putting the right amount in the right place at the right time. It's also a great way for record keeping, and I talk to farmers today and tell them that, you know, you almost need to start keeping these nutrient records like you do your financial books. Prove your need and prove what you did and be accountable for it. So the as-applied maps are just a fantastic tool for the farmer to prove and then recall what was done in the past on that field. And it's also a profit center for suppliers. As I said before, I've never seen anybody go into this entity with and say, boy, I wish we wouldn't have done that.
So as I mentioned, our goal is to help promote ag-retailer products and services that help keep our valuable resources on cropland. And one of the tools that we've created to help do that is a wallet card. It's available to you for free to share with your customers and with your coworkers at your ag retail location. They're great conversation starters about 4 R's between yourself and your growers. We've distributed over 8,000 of these to date in the Western Lake Erie Basin. They're useful for not only ag retailers, but for farmers, conservation districts, and watershed groups. You see a picture of the card here, and on the one side, we talk about high-risk fields for phosphorus losses and the conditions that are present in some fields which make those fields at a greater risk for phosphorus loss and thus worthy of more attention and potentially some additional products and services to help address that risk. So if soil test levels are high, or if the field has high surface runoff potential, so sloping fields, poor drainage, fields with less than 30% crop residue on the soil surface are all fields that are high risk. So these factors can help you identify those fields that your farmer might have that may need extra attention. And then on the opposite side are the practices and products and services that you can promote to help reduce losses from all fields, including those high-risk fields. So we see our custom injection or banding of phosphorus, light incorporation after applications, following recommendations for setbacks, broadcasting phosphorus for only 1 year at a time, and so forth. So you can order these cards for free on our website at partnershipfarm.org, and I hope you'll take advantage of these. I'd like to close with just thanking our funders and our collaborators. Major funding has come from the Great Lakes Protection Fund and also from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, with additional funding from NRCS. And we've had multiple partners collaborating with us on the project, including a number of ag retailers in the Western Lake Erie Basin, getting annual data on those products and services that we've reported to you. Very much appreciate their cooperation and ask you to consider joining us and helping us with this effort to improve water quality in the Great Lakes Basin and increase product and services revenue for ag retailers doing this great work. Thanks very much.